140 carrier-based FA-18 Super Hornets fly 420 combat sorties in 24 hours, destroying 78 Chinese amphibious ships and preventing an invasion. This becomes the most intense sustained carrier air operations since World War II. July 14, 2025, Western Pacific, USS Ronald Reagan and USS Carl Vinson carrier strike groups, 150 nautical miles east of Taiwan. At 4:15 a.m., intelligence detected that China was launching a second invasion attempt toward Taiwan. Having lost their first amphibious fleet 6 weeks earlier, Chinese military planners had assembled a new armada using every available ship. 87 vessels, including military amphibious transports, requisitioned civilian ferries, and hastily converted cargo ships, were departing from multiple ports along China's coast. Intelligence estimates suggested this fleet carried over 15,000 troops, 600 armored vehicles, and supplies for sustained operations. The timeline was critical. The invasion fleet would reach Taiwan's western coast in approximately 36 hours. U.S. carrier strike groups, positioned east of Taiwan, had 24 hours to inflict maximum damage before the fleet entered heavily defended waters near the Chinese coast, where land-based aircraft and surface-to-air missiles would complicate operations. The mission given to the two carrier air wings was unprecedented in modern naval aviation. Launch continuous strikes for 24 hours, destroy as many invasion ships as possible, accept aircraft losses if necessary, stop the invasion. USS Ronald Reagan carried 70 FA-18EF Super Hornets as part of Carrier Air Wing 5. USS Carl Vinson, operating 60 nautical miles south, carried 70 more Super Hornets from Carrier Air Wing 2. Total strike capability, 140 aircraft. Each Super Hornet could carry 4 AGM-158C LRASM anti-ship missiles or 8 500-pound JDAM guided bombs. The mission plan called for mixed loadouts. Early sorties would use LRASMs for long-range strikes. Later sorties would use JDAMs once air defenses were suppressed. Each aircraft was expected to fly 3 sorties in 24 hours, an operational tempo that would push pilots, aircraft, and maintenance crews to their absolute limits. At 5 a.m., the operations began. USS Ronald Reagan launched the first wave. 24 FA-18s, each carrying 4 LRASM missiles, roared off the carrier's deck at 30-second intervals. Within 12 minutes, all 24 aircraft were airborne and forming up for the 180 nautical mile transit to the target area. At 5:30 a.m., USS Carl Vinson launched an identical wave. 48 Super Hornets, carrying 192 LRASM anti-ship missiles, were heading toward the Chinese invasion fleet. At 6:47 a.m., the first wave reached launch range. Chinese air defense radars detected the approaching formation and scrambled fighters. 16 J-16 fighters launched from coastal bases, climbing to intercept the American strike package. But the FA-18s, supported by 4 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, jammed Chinese radars while launching their missiles from 120 nautical miles. At 6:52 a.m., 192 LRASM missiles were in flight, their AI-guided systems coordinating to attack the invasion fleet from multiple directions simultaneously. At 7:15 a.m., the first LRASMs struck. The missiles, flying at low altitude to avoid detection, hit 23 amphibious ships in the first 90 seconds. Each ship, designed for troop transport rather than combat, was devastated by the 1,000-pound warheads. 3 Type 071 amphibious transport docks were hit by multiple missiles and began sinking. 12 Type 072 landing ships were destroyed outright, and 8 civilian ferries, converted for military use and packed with troops, were struck and burning. Within 5 minutes, 23 ships were sinking or disabled. Approximately 2,400 Chinese troops were killed or drowned. The first wave had been devastatingly effective. Should carriers prioritize launching maximum aircraft or maintaining reserve fighters for defense, Type A for maximum offensive operations, Type B for balanced force with defensive reserve. Comment your reasoning. But the first wave was just beginning. At 7:30 a.m., as the initial strike force returned to the carriers for refueling and rearming, the second wave launched. Another 48 FA-18s, carrying 192 more LRASMs, headed toward the now scattered invasion fleet. Chinese air defenses, alerted and reinforced, fired 72 HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles at the approaching formation. 3 FA-18s were hit and destroyed, their pilots ejecting over water and later rescued, but the remaining 45 aircraft launched their missiles. At 9:05 a.m., the second LRASM wave struck. 21 more Chinese ships were destroyed or disabled. The invasion fleet, which had numbered 87 vessels at dawn, was down to 43 operational ships by mid-morning, but Chinese military command ordered the remaining ships to continue toward Taiwan. Stopping the invasion now would mean accepting defeat without even attempting the landing. At 10:00 a.m., as the second strike force recovered aboard the carriers, the third wave prepared to launch. The operational tempo was brutal. Carrier flight deck crews worked continuously, refueling and rearming aircraft as fast as pilots could land. Ordnance teams loaded weapons, fuel crews connected hoses. Quality control inspectors verified each aircraft was flight-worthy, and within 90 minutes of landing, the same aircraft that had flown the first mission were being launched again. At 10:15 a.m., the third wave, 48 FA-18s now carrying JDAMs instead of LRASMs, launched toward the invasion fleet. Subscribe to Navy Mission now for unmatched carrier aviation operations coverage. This is analysis that reveals modern naval air power. This wave faced the most intense opposition yet. Chinese commanders, recognizing the invasion was failing, ordered their remaining capable aircraft to protect the fleet at all costs. 32 J-16 and J-10 fighters engaged the American strike package at 11:30 a.m. The resulting air battle, fought at altitudes between 15,000 and 25,000 feet over the Taiwan Strait, became the largest dogfight of the conflict. 8 Chinese fighters were shot down, but 4 more FA-18s were lost, reducing the American strike force to 44 aircraft for this wave. At 12:15 p.m., the 44 surviving FA-18s reached their targets and dropped 352 JDAM bombs on the remaining invasion ships. The 500-pound bombs, while smaller than LRASMs, were devastating against unarmored transport vessels. 14 more ships were destroyed. The invasion fleet, now reduced to 29 operational vessels, was scattering. Some ships turned back toward China. Others continued stubbornly toward Taiwan despite catastrophic losses, and a few, damaged but still afloat, drifted while crews attempted repairs. By 2:00 p.m., 12 hours into the operation, both carriers had launched 144 sorties. 64 ships had been destroyed. 7 FA-18s had been lost, and the pace showed no signs of slowing. At 2:30 p.m., the fourth wave launched. This time, both carriers contributed smaller formations, 16 aircraft each, 32 total, carrying a mix of LRASMs and JDAMs. The reduced numbers reflected aircraft that required extended maintenance and pilots who needed rest, but operations continued. At 4 p.m., the fourth wave struck the scattered remnants of the invasion fleet. 9 more ships were destroyed. At 6 p.m., the fifth wave launched with 28 aircraft. At 8 p.m., the sixth wave departed with 32 aircraft. Through the evening and into the night, the strikes continued relentlessly. Chinese fighters, low on fuel and ammunition after continuous operations, could mount only sporadic resistance. Air defense systems ran out of missiles or were destroyed by anti-radiation weapons. By midnight, 18 hours into the operation, 280 sorties had been flown. 72 Chinese ships had been destroyed. 10 FA-18s had been lost, 7 to enemy fire and 3 to mechanical failures or accidents during intense flight operations. The surviving pilots flying their third sorties of the day were exhausted, but the mission continued. At 12:30 a.m. on July 15th, the seventh wave launched with 24 aircraft. At 2:00 a.m., as the seventh wave struck the last concentrations of invasion ships, Chinese military command transmitted an order to all remaining vessels: return to port. The invasion is canceled, survive if possible. The remaining 15 operational ships, many damaged, turned toward China at maximum speed. But the American strikes continued. At 4:00 a.m., the eighth and final wave launched with 16 aircraft, pursuing the fleeing ships. At 5:00 a.m. on July the 15th, exactly 24 hours after operations began, the final FA-18 landed aboard USS Carl Vinson. The operation was complete. 420 sorties had been flown by 140 aircraft over 24 hours. Some pilots had flown 4 sorties instead of the planned 3. Maintenance crews had worked without sleep, turning aircraft around in record time, and the result was devastating for China. Final casualty count: 78 of 87 Chinese ships destroyed or sunk. 9 ships survived, all damaged. Over 11,000 Chinese troops killed or drowned. The invasion had been stopped before a single soldier reached Taiwan's beaches. American losses: 11 FA-18s destroyed, 8 to enemy fire, 3 to operational accidents, 9 pilots killed, 5 rescued. The exchange ratio was overwhelmingly favorable, but the cost had been real. Do you think sustaining 420 sorties in 24 hours represents realistic carrier capabilities or exceeds practical limits? Share your assessment below. For the 2 carrier strike groups, July 14-15 represented the most intense sustained operations since World War II. Carrier Air Wing 5 and Air Wing 2 had pushed human endurance and mechanical systems to their limits. Pilots described the operations as exhausting beyond anything experienced in peacetime training. Many flew their third or fourth sorties while physically and mentally depleted, relying on adrenaline and professionalism. Flight deck crews worked until they collapsed, then returned to work after brief rests, and aircraft designed for sustained operations but not this intensity suffered accelerated wear that would require months of maintenance to fully address. For China, July 14-15 became the day when amphibious invasion of Taiwan was proven impossible against American carrier air power. 2 attempts had been made. Both had been annihilated. Over 19,000 troops had been lost at sea across both operations, and China's amphibious assault capability had been so degraded that rebuilding would require years. The strategic reality was clear: Taiwan could not be taken by force as long as American carriers defended it. Beijing's response was a mixture of rage and acceptance. State media blamed American aggression while avoiding acknowledgement of the invasion attempt's failure. Internally, military leaders who had planned the operations faced harsh consequences. Some were dismissed, others faced criminal charges for squandering resources and lives in operations with minimal chance of success. And Chinese military doctrine underwent comprehensive review, recognizing that American carrier air power created vulnerabilities China couldn't overcome. For the families of the 11,000 Chinese troops lost, July 14-15 brought tragedy wrapped in secrecy. Official notifications were delayed or vague. Many families never learned exactly how their loved ones died. The government, embarrassed by the military failures, suppressed details and discouraged public mourning. The soldiers and sailors who died, many of them conscripts fulfilling mandatory service, were buried quietly. Their sacrifice, intended to expand Chinese territory, instead exposed the limits of Chinese military power. The 11 FA-18 pilots who didn't return faced different fates. 5 were rescued by U.S. search and rescue helicopters after ejecting. 4 were recovered by Chinese forces and became prisoners, later repatriated through diplomatic channels. 2 were never found, lost at sea when their aircraft were destroyed at low altitude with insufficient time to eject successfully. Their families received flag-draped coffins containing personal effects, but no bodies were recovered. They were listed as killed in action, honored at ceremonies aboard their carriers. For the 140 FA-18 Super Hornets that flew the 420 sorties, the operation took a toll that extended beyond battle damage. Aircraft designed for 6,000 flight hours before major overhaul had aged the equivalent of months in a single day. Engines required inspection and replacement. Airframes showed stress cracks from repeated catapult launches and arrested landings, and onboard systems, stressed by continuous operations, required extensive troubleshooting. Returning both air wings to full operational status would require 3 months of intensive maintenance. USS Ronald Reagan and USS Carl Vinson, the carriers that had launched the historic operations, received presidential recognition for their role in defending Taiwan. The ship's crews, from admirals to the youngest sailors, had demonstrated that American carrier aviation remained the most powerful conventional military force in existence. The ability to project hundreds of strike sorties across 24 hours from ships operating hundreds of miles at sea was unmatched by any other nation. As the sun rose on July 15th, debris from 78 Chinese ships floated across the Taiwan Strait and western Philippine Sea. Oil slicks stretched for miles. Life rafts, some occupied by survivors, others empty, marked where ships had been destroyed. Chinese and international rescue vessels worked for days to recover survivors, pulling fewer than 4,000 from the water. The remainder, over 7,000 soldiers and sailors, were lost. The strait had become a graveyard marking where China's second invasion attempt had been destroyed. Now I want 3 perspectives from you. First, can modern carriers realistically sustain 420 sorties in 24 hours, or does this exceed practical operational limits? Second, what does this operation reveal about the continuing relevance of carrier aviation in modern warfare? Third, should such intensive operations risk pilot and aircraft losses to achieve strategic objectives? Comment your detailed analysis below. Your insights drive the conversations we have on Navy Mission. And if this breakdown of the most intense carrier air operations in modern history gave you new understanding of naval aviation capabilities, prove it by hitting that like button, subscribing to Navy Mission, and turning on notifications. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay operational, and remember that carrier power is measured not just in aircraft, but in the sustained ability to project force when nations need it most.